Two names were enough to instill fear in Iraq: Uday and Qusay Hussein. Children of the dictator, they grew up among palaces, executions, and an education designed to rule with violence. Since young, they were presented as inevitable heirs. Uday became a symbol of sadism. He controlled sports with torture, kidnapped women, and punished anyone who challenged him. Qusay, quieter, directed the security services. His power was in surveillance, in purges, and in organized repression. One exhibited uncontrolled brutality, the other administered state terror. How did these two men manage to concentrate so much power being so different? What made them pillars of a regime based on fear and obedience? Were they natural heirs of an unbreakable system or just pawns of a fate marked by violence? Heirs of the dictator, blood marked by power. The rise of Saddam Hussein to the presidency of Iraq in July of 1979 was the result of a power consolidation strategy that he had initiated long before. During the previous decade, he had built a network of control that encompassed intelligence services, revolutionary courts, and the surveillance structure of the Ba'ath Party. His formal assumption of office signified the institutionalization of a system where ministries, security agencies, and armed forces functioned as parts of a mechanism oriented towards absolute obedience. From the first days of his mandate, Saddam imposed internal discipline through organized purges. One of the most remembered was the meeting of the Revolutionary Command Council, convened shortly after his appointment. There, the names of militants accused of conspiracy were read, who were removed from the room and executed without delay. The audiovisual recording of that session was distributed among party cadres, making it clear that unconditional loyalty would be the condition to remain in power. In this environment of permanent surveillance grew up Uday and Qusay Hussein. Uday was born in Baghdad in June of 1964 when his father was still imprisoned for political activities. 2 years later came Qusay, also the son of Sajida Talfa, cousin and first wife of Saddam. Sajida's family belonged to the influential Tikriti clan, whose network of tribal connections played a central role in the structure of the regime. From childhood, both were educated in an environment of privilege. They lived in fortified residences under the protection of armed guards and attended schools supervised by the party. Their socialization was not limited to material access, but was marked by exposure to political violence. Later, judicial records indicate that they witnessed executions and punishments ordered by their father as part of a deliberate process of formation in the logic of power. The differences in character manifested themselves early. Uday showed impulsive behaviors, with episodes of violence towards classmates and service staff. Reports collected by Iraqi opponents in exile describe how he used his status as the presidential son to impose himself at school through threats and assaults. Qusay, on the other hand, adopted a more reserved stance, preferring to observe rather than intervene, which gave him an image of greater self-control. The paternal demand accompanied these traits. Saddam asserted that his children should be able to rule with the same harshness as he did. The official propaganda reinforced this expectation by showing Uday and Qusay in public events, presenting them as part of a dynastic continuity. Although the regime maintained the facade of a republic, the presence of the family in the public sphere projected the idea of hereditary succession. The educational design of the brothers was aimed at reinforcing that vision of power. Both studied at elite institutions in Baghdad and then entered university. Uday began engineering studies but dropped out after multiple conduct incidents. Qusay completed the law degree, showing greater academic discipline. This divergence marked the difference between an impulsive temperament and a calculating one, a trait that would continue into adulthood. During the war between Iraq and Iran, which extended through almost the entire decade of the 80s, Saddam consolidated the narrative that the Hussein family represented national resistance against external enemies. Uday and Qusay appeared in that narrative as symbols of continuity, although still without official responsibilities. Direct exposure to repressive episodes reinforced their formation. In 1983, after the failed attack on Saddam in the town of Dujail, more than 300 inhabitants were executed and hundreds imprisoned. Later, judicial documents indicate that the sons were present during part of the detentions, normalizing violence as a tool of government. Saddam's parenthood combined material indulgence with political demand. He provided his children with luxury cars, international trips, and unrestricted access to state resources, but at the same time subjected them to tests of obedience. Close officials noted that he constantly assessed their resilience, ensuring they were capable of withstanding pressures similar to those of any member of his power circle. In youth, the differences were accentuated. Uday adopted a flamboyant lifestyle with frequent parties, alcohol consumption, and displays of wealth. He maintained a collection of sports vehicles and residences in exclusive neighborhoods of Baghdad, surrounded by collaborators whose loyalty was sustained by material benefits. Qusay, on the other hand, approached the security agencies, cultivating ties with military officers and party leaders. For Saddam, this duality was not necessarily an inconvenience. He considered Uday a useful instrument to intimidate society with his unpredictable behavior, while he saw in Qusay a future administrator of the repressive structures. The experience of the war against Iran had shown that the fragmentation of responsibilities was key to ensuring loyalty, and in that scheme, his sons played complementary roles. The uprising of 1991, which occurred after the Gulf War, marked a change in the public projection of the brothers. The regime faced protests in the south and in the north of the country, and amidst that crisis, Uday and Qusay began to receive operational responsibilities. Although still under the direct supervision of their father, they began to be perceived as actors within the machinery of power, beyond mere dynastic symbols. The Iraqi police state became a space where the family functioned as an integral part of the apparatus. Violence and discipline not only structured political life but also domestic dynamics. Saddam conceived of his children as biological heirs, and at the same time, as functional pieces of the control system. The relationship between the two was marked by rivalry. Uday sought to assert himself with displays of strength and luxury, while Qusay consolidated his influence through discretion and closeness with the security organs. This difference in styles defined the roles each would adopt in the following years, when they became central figures of the regime, with direct responsibilities in preserving the system established by their father. The Prince of Sadism, sport turned into torment. The rise of Uday Hussein in Iraqi public life began in the second half of the 1980s, when his father placed him at the head of institutions that combined sports, propaganda, and social control. At just over 20 years of age, he was appointed head of the National Olympic Committee of Iraq, and shortly afterward he assumed the leadership of the Football Association. Those positions granted him considerable power in a country where sports, and particularly football, constituted a source of collective pride. The function of these institutions ceased to be linked to athletic development, and became a mechanism for surveillance and political discipline. The appointment did not respond to merit nor administrative experience. Saddam Hussein saw sport as a useful instrument to strengthen national prestige, and in his elder son, a means to link the family surname with international triumphs. The obedience of athletes was presented as an example for the rest of society. The popularity of soccer allowed the presidential son to be showcased as a figure of authority, associated with the sacrifice that the regime demanded from the population. Since the beginning of his management, Uday implemented a disciplinary regime characterized by physical and psychological punishments. Among them, the most common was the falaka, consisting of whipping the soles of the feet with rods or electrical cables. Subsequent reports by international organizations collected testimonies from athletes who described how they were forced to train immediately after receiving these blows, which caused severe injuries. Another documented method was being forced to kick cement balls for hours, causing fractures and permanent damage to muscles and joints. These practices were applied under direct orders from Uday, with the purpose of instilling fear and guaranteeing submission. The facilities of the Olympic Committee were transformed into clandestine detention spaces. In the basements of the main building in Baghdad, there were rooms where electric shocks were applied, waterboarding simulations and beatings with metal tubes. Those affected were not only athletes but also coaches, sports doctors, and officials accused of disloyalty. In this context, the case of a soccer player who was kidnapped from his bed and taken to the committee's headquarters was recorded, where he remained several days subjected to punishment with electric cables, food deprivation, and additional torture in presidential quarters. Accounts agree that he was dragged over rough surfaces, forced to roll in contaminated sand to infect his wounds, and submerged in sewage in a process of systematic degradation. The control of the Football Association amplified Uday's reach. The national team and the most important clubs were closely followed throughout the country, turning each defeat into a matter of state. In international tournaments, poor results were interpreted as personal affronts. During the Asian Cup of Nations of 1996, after the elimination of the Iraqi team, several players were imprisoned and beaten by direct order of the leader. The repression extended to the journalistic field. Sports reporters were subject to strict censorship, as any criticism was considered an offense to the Hussein family. Newspapers that tried to question technical decisions were closed, and journalists who published uncomfortable articles were arrested or disappeared. Some reappeared weeks later with obvious signs of torture. Others never returned. Sports journalism became a space where it was only possible to praise the regime. The coaches also were under pressure. Foreign coaches who worked in Iraq during the 80s and 90s later reported that they received detailed instructions on lineups and tactics, under threat of reprisals if the results were not as expected. The local coaches faced an even greater risk. The sanctions could include beatings, detention, or loss of their positions. The control of the sport thus became an extension of the repressive apparatus, with Uday as the central figure. Uday's violent behavior transcended sports and manifested in other settings. In 1988, during an official reception in honor of the wife of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, he beat Kamil Hanna Gegeo, Saddam's personal butler, to death, accusing him of facilitating an extramarital relationship for his father. The murder, publicly committed with a knife, caused a diplomatic incident that forced Saddam to temporarily remove him from the public scene. As a disciplinary measure, Uday was sent to Switzerland with a position at the Iraqi embassy, but his stay was brief due to new episodes of violence. Despite this background, Uday returned to Baghdad and regained influence. The violence, instead of limiting his career, became a distinctive feature of his exercise of power. He accumulated luxury cars, properties, and weapons, while expanding his control network around the importation of sports equipment and the organization of competitions. Business people, coaches, players, and journalists depended on his approval. Sports became a stage of personalistic authority, exercised without accountability. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, his name had become synonymous with fear in the Iraqi sports arena. Although the regime banned internal criticism, testimonies from exiles who managed to escape began to spread in Arab and Western media, revealing details about the repression in the Olympic Committee and the Football Association. These reports helped to cement the image of Uday as an unpredictable and brutal leader. The contrast with his brother Qusay became increasingly evident. While the latter cultivated relationships with security services and projected an image of control and calculation, Uday was perceived as unstable and prone to violent outbursts. However, his status as the eldest son assured him a prominent place in Saddam's succession aspirations. The control of sport, although secondary in political terms, granted him national and international visibility. The regime showcased him in ceremonies and competitions, reinforcing the perception that the Hussein family remained at the pinnacle of power. The accumulation of privileges and the absence of disciplinary limits consolidated a contradictory profile. Uday was simultaneously a symbol of power and a figure associated with lack of control. His authority did not come from sporting achievements nor from administrative capacity, but from the systematic use of violence as a means of governance. For Iraqi society, his presence meant the constant possibility of arbitrariness, an extension of the system established by Saddam, but with a personal stamp that combined ostentation, brutality, and fear. Empire of pleasure and horror, the hidden kingdom of Uday. The power of Uday Hussein was not limited to sports. Throughout the 1990s, his influence expanded into a parallel system of control based on kidnapping, sexual exploitation, and the use of violence as a tool of domination. His image became associated with drug use, coercion through video recordings, and the construction of an environment where impunity was assured by his status as a presidential son. The testimonies of exiles, journalists, and human rights organizations indicate that a systematic pattern of abductions was developed in different social settings. Weddings were one of the spaces where his presence was feared. Armed guards would interrupt ceremonies to demand the participation of the bride or other women in the celebration. Refusal often involved the abduction of the woman or violent punishment against the husband or family members. At the beginning of 2003, a case was recorded in Baghdad where a young woman was taken from the ceremony in her dress and transferred directly to one of his residences. Abbas al-Janabi, Uday's personal secretary for more than a decade, described these incidents as habitual and part of the leader's entertainment. The universities constituted another setting for forced recruitment. Uday's emissaries roamed the campuses of Baghdad to identify young women. Refusal of their requests could result in sanctions for the families, who would lose state jobs or be subject to investigations for supposed political disloyalty. On the streets, the procedure was even more direct. Luxury vehicles with escorts intercepted the women and took them by force. Once under his control, the victims were subjected to drugs and alcohol to nullify resistance. The assaults were recorded on video and later used as a tool for blackmail. In a society where family honor played a central role, the threat of spreading those recordings ensured silence and obedience. The control extended beyond the women directly affected, reaching entire families, who were subordinated to Uday's will through economic and political pressures. Testimonies from collaborators who defected described rooms in his residences equipped with hidden cameras intended for this purpose. Uday's mansions included areas intended for what he called harems. They were spaces arranged to keep several women under surveillance. Some stayed for weeks, others only a few days, always in conditions of forced silence. The victims came from different backgrounds. Daughters of high-ranking officials, used as a means of pressure on their families, and women from more modest origins, kidnapped directly on the public street. Former collaborators reported that he stored large quantities of imported pornographic material and recreational drugs, which he combined with private parties attended by friends and acquaintances. According to al-Janabi's testimony, by his 30s, he became interested in very young girls, whom he intoxicated and drugged before assaulting them, always recording the scenes. Uday's violence was not restricted to the sexual realm. In 1988, he committed a murder during an official reception. During an event in honor of Suzanne Mubarak, wife of the Egyptian president, he attacked Kamel Hanna-Gegeo, Saddam Hussein's personal butler. He accused him of having facilitated his father's extramarital relationship with Samira Shabandar, which affected Uday's mother. In the presence of guests and diplomats, Gegeo received multiple blows with a metallic object until he died. The incident caused a diplomatic conflict that forced Saddam to intervene. His son was briefly detained and sent to Switzerland, where he held a position at the Iraqi embassy in Geneva. The stay was short. New episodes of violence precipitated his return to Baghdad. In December 1996, Uday suffered an attack in the Iraqi capital while driving one of his sports cars. He was ambushed by an armed group that opened fire on him, hitting him multiple times. Taken to the Ibn Sina hospital, he underwent extensive surgeries, but projectiles remained embedded in his spine that could not be removed. He survived, although with a permanent limp and limited mobility. The attack was attributed by some to Shiite opposition groups and by others to internal rivalries within the security apparatus. Beyond its origin, the episode reduced his ability to project the image of energy and dominance that had characterized him. During recovery, he turned to foreign doctors and alternative treatments. Among them was the visit from the American hypnotist Larry Garrett, who worked with him in Baghdad in 2001 to alleviate chronic pain and mobility issues. Garrett later recounted the sessions in books published in the West, describing Uday as a proud and courteous man in demeanor, though subjected to episodes of violence outside his professional control. Until the mid-1990s, Uday was considered the natural heir to Saddam Hussein due to his status as the firstborn and his high media exposure. However, after the 1996 attack, his position began to weaken. The physical incapacity, coupled with the perception of instability and excess, led Saddam to progressively favor Qusay as a more suitable figure for succession. The loss of prominence did not mean the disappearance of his power. He maintained control of the Olympic Committee, expanded his influence in media and business, and in 1995 created the Fedayeen Saddam, a paramilitary militia that functioned as a personal force. Its members wore black uniforms inspired by symbols of popular culture and carried out operations that combined repressive violence with propagandistic display. Under his command, these forces carried out public executions and intimidation campaigns against opponents. The methods of repression associated with Uday included torture with welding torches applied to prisoners' faces, prolonged confinements in coffins as a form of psychological punishment, and exemplary executions. After the First Gulf War, he visited detention centers where he personally oversaw punishments to Shiite prisoners, even using an electric drill as an execution instrument. The last years of his life were marked by an increase in drug and alcohol consumption, accompanied by more frequent use of his private harems. The documentation gathered after the fall of the regime showed that between the late 1990s and the invasion of 2003, his violence intensified. Internally, he had become an obstacle to the stability of the regime, but the family structure and the absence of political counterweights allowed him to continue acting without restrictions. Invisible architect, the shadow that sustained the regime. The rise of Uday Hussein within the structure of the regime was gradual and meticulous, in contrast to the public and erratic exposure of his older brother. From the late 1980s, he began to receive positions related to internal security, especially in those organizations whose mission was to ensure the president's protection and to dismantle any attempt at opposition. While Uday became visible in sports settings and in episodes of unpredictable violence, Qusay built a quieter but decisive power for the survival of the system. In 1988, he was appointed director of Al-Amn al-Khas, Special Security, one of the most sensitive branches of the Iraqi intelligence apparatus. This institution had as its main function to safeguard the president, supervise the loyalty of the Republican Guard, and ensure internal control of the ruling circle. Under Qusay's direction, Special Security acquired budgetary and operational autonomy. The selection of its members was based on criteria of personal trust and tribal affiliation, reinforcing the primacy of the Tikriti clan in the power structures. The position granted him direct access to the most sensitive information of the state. He received daily reports on ministers, officers, and Ba'ath Party leaders, making him a central figure in the surveillance system. From that position, he cultivated an image of an efficient administrator in contrast to the scandalous notoriety of his brother. The discreet management, based on control and supervision, strengthened his influence without the need for public projection. Over time, he extended his control to the Mukhabarat, the intelligence service that formerly depended on the National Security Office, but in practice responded to his supervision in the most delicate operations. The Mukhabarat was responsible for repression against opponents both inside and outside Iraq. Under his orbit, operations of espionage, surveillance, and selective assassinations abroad were organized. Actions were documented in Jordan, Lebanon, and several European countries, directed against exiles who were trying to organize resistance movements. The coordination between Al-Amn al-Khas and the Mukhabarat consolidated a repressive framework that placed Qusay at the center of decision-making in security matters. During the 90s, this system carried out operations to eliminate Shia insurgents in the south and Kurdish militants in the north, reinforcing the regime's territorial control. The Gulf War of 1991 marked a turning point. After the withdrawal from Kuwait, Shiite insurrections erupted in the south and Kurdish uprisings in the north. During those weeks, large areas temporarily escaped central control. Qusay personally led the repression using units from the Republican Guard and Special Security. The operations included aerial bombardments, use of heavy artillery, and summary executions. In cities like Karbala and Najaf, international reports described destruction of residential neighborhoods, attacks on sanctuaries, and executions of prisoners. In the north, operations against the Kurds caused a massive exodus towards the border with Turkey. Entire villages were demolished and forced displacements were combined with air attacks. The repression left a trail of destruction that cemented Qusay's image as the direct enforcer of the regime's harshest measures. After the uprisings, he implemented an additional strategy against the Shiite communities of the south. The Mesopotamian marshes, located between the Tigris and the Euphrates, had served as a refuge for insurgents and dissenters. Under Qusay's directives, the regime undertook a large-scale drainage project. Dikes and canals were built that diverted the course of the rivers, drastically reducing the flooded area. The goal was to deprive opponents of a natural sanctuary and disrupt the communities of the marsh Arabs. The impact was devastating. In less than 1 decade, the swampy area lost most of its extent, forcing tens of thousands of people to leave their homes and causing the destruction of an ancient ecosystem. The drainage operations were complemented by direct attacks against villages, house fires, and executions. The strategy represented a process of cultural and social uprooting carried out under the direct supervision of Special Security. During the same decade, Qusay expanded his influence through the National Security Council. From there, he coordinated all the intelligence agencies and the armed forces, articulating a network that integrated the army, the Republican Guard, the Mukhabarat, and his own Special Security. His decision-making ability made him the second most powerful man in Iraq in operational terms, with authority only exceeded by that of his father. Simultaneously, he played a fundamental role in the administration of the Oil for Food program, established by the United Nations in 1996-96 as a measure to alleviate the humanitarian crisis derived from international sanctions. Qusay controlled the allocation of contracts, imports, and distribution, which allowed resources to be diverted towards the ruling elite and consolidate networks of loyalty. This management not only guaranteed the financial survival of the regime, but also granted it its own base of economic power. The combination of repressive control and resource management positioned him as the preferred heir, as Uday was marginalized. Following the 1996 attack, which physically weakened his brother and given the perception of his erratic behavior, Saddam began to trust Qusay as a more stable figure. Intelligence reports from the late 90s agreed that, although Uday retained formal positions, it was Qusay who really exercised control over the key institutions. The contrast between the brothers was evident. Uday embodied visible violence and arbitrariness. Qusay represented the systematic organization of the repressive apparatus. His relationship with military commanders and his control over the Republican Guard reinforced his legitimacy as a successor. Saddam, aware of the need to preserve the regime's stability in the face of international isolation, trusted him as a guarantor of continuity. Qusay did not seek media prominence, nor did he cultivate a striking public image. His power lay in the ability to issue orders, direct operations, and distribute resources. His discretion, coupled with the efficiency with which he managed the security system, consolidated the perception that he was the true architect of the country's internal control. He was not the most well-known figure to the population, but he was the most influential in preserving the regime during its last few years of existence. Two shadows over Iraq, the country caught between brothers. The regime of Saddam Hussein found in his two sons a functional balance between immediate violence and organized repression. Uday represented open brutality, while Qusay consolidated a structured system of control through the security agencies. This duality defined life in Iraq during the 1990s and the early years of the new century, when personal arbitrariness and institutional surveillance combined into one apparatus of domination. Uday was the embodiment of visible and excessive power. His presence in public life was associated with episodes of violence in everyday spaces, kidnappings, punishments in the sports field, impulsive murders, and displays of wealth. The unpredictability of his behavior kept society on permanent alert. The message was clear. Any chance encounter with the president's son could have fatal consequences, with no possibility of legal protection. Qusay acted from within the structures of the state. At the head of the special security, the Mukhabarat and the Republican Guard, he ensured constant control of the population. His power did not depend on visible gestures, but on permanent networks of surveillance, detentions, and punishments. The threat was twofold. On one side, the arbitrary violence of Uday. On the other, the repressive machinery organized under Qusay's supervision. Far from competing during this period, the brothers complemented each other, one sowing fear with spectacular actions, and the other ensuring that no opposition could be articulated. In 1995, Uday founded the Fedayeen Saddam, a paramilitary militia conceived as a personal force and as an instrument of social intimidation. Recruited from loyal youth and members of tribes linked to the presidential clan, the Fedayeen operated outside the formal military chain. Their training included extreme physical punishments and the demand for total obedience to the Hussein family. The black uniforms and public demonstrations of violence were part of their identity and functioned as a propaganda mechanism. These units patrolled streets, conducted raids, and punished citizens accused of disobedience. Their practices included public beheadings, filmed torture, and collective punishments against entire families. The Fedayeen also used visible methods of punishment, such as branding the foreheads of army deserters with hot irons, amputating the ears of traders accused of profiteering, or flogging young people caught violating curfews. The acts were carried out in squares and markets to ensure the exemplary effect. Meanwhile, Qusay managed the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard, the best equipped and most loyal units of the regime. These forces operated as a parallel army, with salary privileges and access to modern weaponry. Their loyalty was ensured through a system of promotions and appointments directly controlled by Qusay, who selected officers based on their personal loyalty and tribal ties. The structure was designed to respond solely to the president and his son. The role of these forces was decisive in the repression of the insurrections of 1991 after the Gulf War. The Republican Guard participated in the recovery of rebel cities in the south and the north through bombings, mass executions, and deliberate destruction of entire neighborhoods. In the south, Shiite communities were deported to internment camps in the center of the country. In the north, Kurdish villages were razed, forcing the displacement of thousands of people to the mountains and the borders. In Baghdad and its surroundings, the Republican Guard also carried out preventive functions against any coup d'état attempt. It controlled access to presidential palaces, communication centers, and strategic weaponry depots. This absolute control reinforced Qusay's status as heir, being the guarantor of the military stability of the regime. The surveillance system reached the daily life of the population. Informants from the party and intelligence services operated in schools, universities, public offices, and residential neighborhoods. A comment considered critical could lead to detentions, interrogations, and torture. This control network extended the presence of the regime to the domestic sphere. Universities were a top priority target. Professors and students suspected of sympathizing with opposition movements were reported and subjected to sanctions. Places of worship were also subject to supervision, especially in Shiite regions, where critical sermons could lead to the closure of mosques and the disappearance of religious leaders. In rural areas, security forces acted jointly with the Fedayeen, applying collective punishments to entire villages accused of collaborating with insurgents. The commercial spaces and markets were equally monitored. Undercover agents listened to conversations and recorded expressions of discontent. Merchants accused of criticizing the regime faced economic sanctions or the loss of their businesses. Primary schools taught slogans of loyalty to the party, and children were encouraged to report what they heard at home. Distrust permeated family and community relationships. Hospitals, under the supervision of security services, were also integrated into the control system. Doctors were obliged to report injuries that could be linked to opposing activities. Patients with bullet wounds or suspicious fractures were interrogated before receiving care. Medical staff who refused to cooperate faced detention or suspension of professional licenses. Life in Iraq was marked by this repressive duality. Uday represented the arbitrary power capable of intruding into any social sphere, while Qusay ensured the continuity of the system through military bodies and intelligence institutions. For ordinary citizens, the danger could come from both a casual encounter with the elder son and the structured surveillance of the younger one. The population developed survival strategies that included avoiding public gatherings, restricting telephone conversations, and teaching children rules of silence. Merchants displayed portraits of the president in their stores and practiced automatic expressions of loyalty. Women modified daily routines to reduce the possibility of encounters with Uday or his subordinates. Families lived under the certainty that any action could attract the attention of one of the two poles of power. In practice, Iraqi society was trapped between two forms of violence, the unpredictable and personal one of Uday and the systematic and institutionalized one of Qusay. This combination prevented any form of independent organization. The regime did not rest solely on the figure of Saddam, but on the interaction of his sons as complementary executors of a system that infiltrated all aspects of national life. The relentless hunt, the betrayal that broke loyalty. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 marked the beginning of the collapse of the system built by Saddam Hussein and his closest circle. On the 20th of March, the military operation led by the United States began with an air campaign called Shock and Awe. The massive bombings aimed to paralyze the regime's response capability through simultaneous attacks on Baghdad and other strategic cities. The coalition's ground forces advanced from the south, facing scattered resistance that was unable to halt their advance towards the capital. On the 9th of April, Baghdad fell. The images of the statue of Saddam Hussein toppled in Firdos Square were broadcast around the world as a symbol of the end of an era. However, neither the president nor his sons were captured in the initial offensive. The state apparatus crumbled in a matter of days, regular military units disappeared, and the Republican Guard, under Qusay's command, was unable to sustain the defense of the capital. Amid the power vacuum, the United States developed a search system that combined operational identification with psychological pressure, a deck of 55 cards representing the most wanted leaders. Saddam appeared as the ace of spades, Uday as the ace of hearts, and Qusay as the ace of clubs. The deck, distributed among the troops, served both to facilitate the identification of the fugitives and to show that capturing the Hussein family was a priority. The economic incentive also became a tool. $15 million were offered for information leading to the capture of each of Saddam's sons. The amount aimed to break the tribal and family loyalty that had protected the clan for decades. In a country impoverished by sanctions, the sum equaled more than what a family could imagine accumulating over generations, creating a powerful stimulus for collaboration. After the fall of Baghdad, Uday and Qusay tried to reorganize. Intelligence reports indicate that in April they moved north, relying on the tribal networks built over the years. In the first 72 hours of bombings, they had changed location more than 10 times, using patterns designed in secret exercises practiced previously. One of the main plans consisted of escaping to Syria. A convoy they were traveling in tried to cross the border at Al-Qaim, but was forced to return. Damascus, under international pressure, denied entry. On April 15th, through diplomatic channels, Syria notified that granting asylum to the Husseins would be interpreted as an act of war. The refusal thwarted the most viable escape route. Faced with the inability to leave the country, they resorted to the network of safe houses that the family had prepared in advance. These residences were located in rural and urban areas, protected by loyal clans. They had provisions for several months, weapons, communication systems, and modified vehicles. Their construction had involved a multi-million-dollar investment and the work of thousands of people, later eliminated to maintain secrecy. For weeks, the brothers moved between different shelters, staying a short time in each one. They used convoys of identical vehicles with body doubles to confuse aerial surveillance. Some cars, like the civilian sedans used in Baghdad and Mosul, had homemade armor and concealed encrypted communication equipment under a common appearance. The United States intelligence services intensified the tracking. Local informants were employed, satellite monitoring of electrical consumption, communication interceptions, and analysis of financial movements. However, Qusay had anticipated these techniques and prohibited the use of electronic devices, relying on foot messengers. The caution complicated the work of the search teams. In May of 2003, hundreds of reports were recorded claiming sightings of the fugitives in different cities, from Basra to Kurdistan. Each lead required verification through covert operations, photographic recognition, and intelligence analysis, which consumed significant resources and delayed results. Finally, the persecution concentrated in Mosul. The city, one of the main centers in the north, was home to Sunni Arab communities with tribal ties linked to the regime. During the 90s, Qusay had invested resources to consolidate Mosul as a safe stronghold, directing contracts to local entrepreneurs and establishing strategic matrimonial links between families from Tikrit and clans in the region. In Mosul, the brothers took shelter in a residence of Nawaf al-Zaidan, a member of an influential family and collaborator of the regime since the late 1990s. Al-Zaidan had demonstrated the ability to trade in prohibited goods during the sanctions thanks to cross-border family connections. His reputation for discretion made him a reliable host for the Hussein family. The villa had specific security features: reinforced walls, impact-resistant windows, and an escape tunnel connected to the municipal drainage system. The design allowed resistance to conventional assaults and offered alternative evacuation routes. These precautions reflected the level of planning with which the family had conceived their shelters. However, tribal loyalty was eroded by military pressure and rewards. Nawaf al-Zaidan, aware of the value of the information he possessed and the risks of protecting the Husseins, made contact with American forces. His decision responded to a combination of incentives: the possibility of receiving $30 million and the expectation of obtaining protection against future reprisals. On the 19th of July, the first contact occurred through Jalil al-Masri, a textile merchant with links to American troops. In a seemingly routine conversation, he mentioned that an acquaintance was harboring high-value individuals. The references to two brothers and the description of their characteristics sparked immediate interest. The following day, an intelligence officer met with al-Masri in a cafe downtown Mosul. There he received specific details that confirmed the truthfulness of the information: scars on Uday's body, medication routines, the presence of a teenager, and precise descriptions of the dwelling used as a hideout. These pieces of evidence were impossible to fabricate without direct access to the fugitives. The established credibility initiated the negotiations. Al-Zaidan demanded the full payment of the reward, the evacuation of his family, and security guarantees under a new identity. The United States accepted the conditions in a few hours, recognizing the strategic value of the collaboration. With this, the fate of Uday and Qusay was sealed, who until that moment had managed to evade capture thanks to a protection system that began to fracture under the pressure of rewards and the collapse of the regime. Last battle, Mosul, tomb of the Hussein lineage. In July of 2003, the pursuit against Uday and Qusay Hussein culminated in a military operation that took place in the city of Mosul. The villa where they were taking refuge had been prepared as a fortified point. Inside, there were automatic rifles, ammunition, and hand grenades. The windows were reinforced with heavy furniture, and the occupants had decided to resist any attempt at capture. In addition to Saddam Hussein's 2 sons, there were Mustafa, Qusay's teenage son, and Abid Hamid Mahmoud, a veteran bodyguard of the Republican Guard. On the morning of the 22nd of July, armored vehicles converged on the Al-Falah neighborhood from several directions. By mid-morning, the high temperatures added physical difficulty to the operation. Task Force 20 completed the encirclement in less than 1 hour. Bradley combat vehicles blocked all escape routes, snipers positioned themselves on nearby rooftops, and reconnaissance helicopters transmitted real-time images to the command center. The first negotiation attempt was made using loudspeakers. An Iraqi-American translator communicated to the occupants that they were surrounded and had to surrender. The response was immediate. A shot from a window hit the armor of a Bradley. The gesture confirmed the decision to resist. The commander of the operation, Colonel Joe Anderson, authorized the start of the confrontation. The first phase was characterized by crossfire between the defenders' automatic rifles and the mounted machine guns of the American forces. The occupants used furniture as barricades and fired from calculated positions. Mustafa, at just 14 years old, handled an automatic rifle with remarkable discipline, controlling a flank of the building. His prior training allowed him to execute precise shots that forced the attackers to take extreme precautions. Minutes later, a grenade launched from the second floor exploded near a team attempting to approach the main entrance. 2 soldiers were wounded and were evacuated under fire. The resistance forced the U.S. forces to raise the level of force employed. Around noon, TOW missiles were fired at the structure. The first opened a breach in the wall and caused the partial collapse of part of the roof. However, the occupants had foreseen scenarios of this type and moved to less damaged areas, maintaining their response capability. The arrival of Apache helicopters added additional firepower. A Hellfire missile struck the center of the second floor, causing severe structural damage and sparking internal fires. Despite the destruction, after several minutes of silence, firing resumed from positions still operational. Audio recordings collected during the pause showed Qusay coordinating the defense, ordering to redistribute ammunition and hold positions until the end. The second Hellfire, fired shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, hit the north wing where Mustafa was located. The explosion worsened the collapse of the structure and significantly reduced the intensity of the defensive fire. Even so, the occupants continued to resist, using controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. Between 2 and 3:30 in the afternoon, the American forces implemented a tactic of fire saturation with machine guns, automatic rifles, and grenade launchers. The constant pressure sought to completely exhaust the defenders' resources. The brief and precise bursts they received indicated that, despite the wear, the coordination under Qusay's command was maintained. An attempt at a ground assault was repelled with grenades and precise shots. The casualties forced a postponement of an immediate entry. The confrontation continued for several more hours, until around 4:20 in the afternoon, a final TOW missile was fired at the area where movements were still detected. The impact caused the internal collapse of the structure, blocking access and burying defensive positions. At 4:50 in the afternoon, after minutes of absolute silence, assault teams entered the villa. The air inside was filled with smoke and dust, reducing visibility to a few meters. Using ropes, the soldiers descended through breaches created by the missiles. The bodies were found in what had been a bedroom. Uday lay with his weapon still in his hands, with multiple bullet wounds. Qusay was behind an improvised barricade surrounded by empty shells that evidenced prolonged resistance. Mustafa was found next to his father, with shrapnel wounds that confirmed his active participation until the final moments. Abid, the bodyguard, died in a corridor trying to reposition himself. The autopsies confirmed the identities. The bodies were photographed and the images circulated to publicly demonstrate the brothers' death. Due to facial damage, some features were reconstructed before the photographs were taken. Later, the remains were buried in Tikrit in a discreet process, without formal rituals and without visible markers. The exact location was kept under military control, preventing the burials from becoming gathering sites. With the end of the confrontation, the direct lineage of Saddam Hussein became extinct in the rubble of Mosul. The operation confirmed the decision of the brothers to fight until the last moment rather than surrender, marking the outcome of a pursuit that had lasted months and symbolized the definitive collapse of the most intimate core of the regime.